I'm Dr. Duke, and I am together again with Alex Newman, correspondent for the New American Magazine. And Alex, like I said many times before you've been on the show, you are a bit of a polymath. You can talk about a lot of things. You've reported about a lot of things. And today we're going to talk about the United Nations. Bad news, United Nations, right? I mean, the idea that after World War II, the United Nations was going to be a helpful agency who was going to let free nations and global nations get along better. How foolish would you have to be to not believe that sooner or later they would seek to govern the world? And that's kind of where we're moving now, isn't it, Alex?
It is. It absolutely is, Duke. And if you go back to the people who set up the United Nations, the warning signs, the red flags, if we want to be funny about it, were absolutely everywhere. You had on one, the founding powers after World War II. You had really the Soviet Union and the United States were the two that mattered, and then the British helped a little bit. But so on one side of the table, you had Joseph Stalin, a mass murderer who wanted to exterminate millions of people and enslave humanity under a global communist dictatorship. Then on the other side of the table, you had our people, right? We sent a guy called Alger, and boy, did they love Alger. That should have been our first warning sign. They made him the Secretary General of the UN. He got to run the conference where they came up with the UN Charter. Then a few years later, we ended up throwing him in prison because he was an agent of Stalin, and we proved that in court that he was committing perjury. So that was a big warning sign. Even the people who weren't technically busted working with Stalin and betraying the United States, people like John Foster Dulles, one of the founding fathers of the Council on Foreign Relations, he wrote in his book War or Peace that the UN was supposed to serve as the embryonic nucleus of the future world government. And he said, actually, there's no proposal for world government with teeth in it that I've seen that we couldn't carry out under the Charter of the United Nations, which purports to obligate the United States to commit troops whenever the UN Security Council demands it, as opposed to our method where Congress has to declare war. So right from the beginning, it was clear that this was the goal. But it did take them 70 years before they finally came out of the closet and just started admitting that, hey, we want to be the global government. You're going to submit to us. Ban Ki-moon is now calling the UN the Parliament of Humanity. He was the Secretary General until recently. So, now they're out of the closet on this, but we should have known all along, Duke.
Yeah, we should have. And anybody who's been paying attention over the last 10 years knows that you've got civil rights and human rights commissions at the United States, that the member nations overseeing those committees are radical violators of human rights, right? You've got the Cubans, you've got the Venezuelans, you've got some of the worst regimes in the world in these dog and pony show committees. We got Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, that's been condemned by the UN. How many times? Right, versus all the militarized Islamists that surround them, that the UN can't seem to make a single resolution to condemn. The whole thing is just a scam, really, isn't it?
It is. It's an enormous fraud, and what's so interesting is how now they are out in the open about it. So in the cover story we have in the New American, it's called UN to America, We're the Boss. We just go through example after example where these I call it the Dictators Club. So where the Dictators Club is just barking orders at the United States. Like, for example, Alabama and some of the other states passed laws of restricting the murder of unborn babies. And the UN said, oh, you can't do that. International human rights law requires that the U.S. government step in and ensure the perpetuation of mass slaughter of unborn babies. Trump tried to, lock down the border and implement actually U.S. law. U.S. law does not allow people to come to the United States from Central America, crossing through a safe country, Mexico, and then claim, oh, there's violence and poverty in my country, so I need to be a refugee. U.S. law is very clear. Those are not reasons to become a refugee. And if you pass through a safe country, Mexico, you cannot come and claim asylum in the United States. That's not how refugee law works in the United States. Well, Trump tried to implement this, which, is U.S. law. This was passed by Congress. The UN said, oh, no, you can't do that. You have to let them onto your territory. You have to give them refugee status. You have to let them have a hearing. So again, the UN is butting into our affairs. And the bigger picture here that I think everybody needs to understand is that as we move toward this model of global governance that the United Nations is pushing, we're moving away from Americanism, which is what our founding fathers established. And the two are as different as night and day. There are some very superficial similarities, but when you compare the UN's vision of human rights with the founding fathers' vision of inalienable, God-given rights, the two are for all intents and purposes, they are opposites. And so we really dig into that in the article.
And isn't it amazing that you've got the UN dictating our border law, our refugee laws, how we will and won't do things? And it's interesting to me that the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy is 100% behind the UN in this. So we've got a godless UN who argues that our rights derive from government, the UN, not from God. And then you got the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, who is calling for, you and I did a conversation about this a couple weeks ago, for a global education system, right? A collectivist global education system that fits right in with UNESCO that would ultimately destroy Christian education. If you're giving kids a monolithic global education, by definition, that will be not only not a religious education, it will be anti-religious education. And this is the leader of roughly 2 billion Roman Catholics becoming more of a UN globalist than he is watching out for actual Christian values.
That's exactly right. It's very strange, Duke. And, I've seen very prominent Catholics talk about this stuff as heresy, as actually satanic doctrines. There's Mother Miriam, who read on her program, a wonderful Catholic nun who has a radio show and a talk show. Some of the episodes are seen just on YouTube by hundreds of thousands of people. And she was reading our special report that you and I did in Rescuing Our Children in the New American. And in that episode, she talks about some of the stuff that the Pope is saying, like that we have to obey the United Nations and that we need a global village to educate the children for a new humanism. She says, not only are we not required to obey this stuff that the Pope is saying as Catholics, right? These contradict Catholic teaching. She said these are heresies. These are satanic ideas that the Pope is spreading, and we are not obligated to obey them. Yes, we need to be respectful of the Pope's office and the Pope himself, but we do not need to obey these things. And it's all converging in this globalist nightmare that is coming into view now. And this whole issue of the difference between God-given rights and human rights is, I think, going to become more and more fundamental. So what we went through in our article, we talk about how the UN is actually claiming that our God-given rights are violations of human rights. So they say that spanking your children as a disciplinary tool is a violation of human rights, and that the U.S. government needs to throw parents in jail who discipline their children that way. They say that gun rights are a violation of international human rights law because racism and other things that have absolutely nothing to do with gun rights. They say that self-defense laws violation of UN human rights. They say free speech violation of human rights. So you have a dictators club that is completely out of control, and unless we take urgent steps to put a stop to this, it's going to swallow our freedom and it's going to swallow our country.
Do you find we got a couple of minutes left, Alex. Do you find anywhere in the world this is being countered? We get some Eastern European countries that seem to be standing up a little bit to this. Poland to a lesser degree. Hungary seems to be aware of it. You've got factions inside America who are trying to fight back against this. But it's amazing to me how the Republicans of the United States seem to be just as bad as the Democrats and willing to cede global oversight to the UN. Where is the real pushback going to come, if it comes at all?
Yeah, well, there is an interesting resistance movement developing. I think Trump has really emboldened a lot of people around the world to take action here. So you have Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who talks about the UN's global warming scam as a Marxist ruse to destroy Western civilization. They told the UN, you can take your climate circus elsewhere, because they were originally scheduled to be in Brazil. This was scheduled back when Brazil had a communist government. They said, no, you can take your clown show somewhere else. Thank you very much. It's not coming to Brazil. You have, as you mentioned, Viktor Orban in Hungary. You have the Poles. You have a really interesting example came up with this mass migration pact. In December, the UN was trying to shove through this international kind of pseudo treaty. They didn't want to call it a treaty because they knew the U.S. Senate would never ratify it, but they called it an agreement on mass migration, trying to make international migration a human right. Well, Trump was the first one to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do that. And then after that, it was just like dominoes. Then it was Viktor Orban said, we're not going to sign on either. Then you had Austria, you had Croatia, you had Chile, you had Brazil, you had Israel, you had all the countries that the migrants want to go to saying, we're not going to participate in this fraud. So it was an early sign of resistance. We've been talking about education. Now Trump withdrew us from UNESCO, a major, if only temporary, victory in this struggle. Trump has gotten us out of multiple UN agreements. He's now in the process of getting us out of the Paris Agreement. We've got to hope that goes through. So a lot of progress on this front. You won't hear about it from the fake media unless it's to demonize Trump. But there is a powerful resistance movement building against this globalism. Trump's speech at the UN General Assembly gave some very interesting comments on all this. So it's a fascinating time to be alive, Duke.
Yeah, it is. And let lesson sink. If you want to understand what the globalist UN will do if they get power, just look at the nonstop investigation and slander of Donald Trump for 3 years, right? Here's the president of the free world, duly elected. It's not just progressive media in America. This is a global campaign to smear perhaps the one world leader with the power to actually fight back against this globalist cabal. Alex Newman, thanks for your time today.